I know that we're going to talk about World War One, and most of the time when we think about World War One, we think about, the Western Front in Europe and trench warfare and being gassed, like the drawing here. But for the United States, we have to start with another foreign policy issue, and that is Mexico. So we want to start first off in talking about kind of moving forward from our discussion of foreign policy before, and also the discussion of populism and progressivism, is that progressivism really split the Republican Party. And the result was that the one Republican who was pretty popular and also very much a progressive was Theodore Roosevelt. And in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt decided to run for president again because William Howard Taft, who was president, was not interested in progressive measures. And so he ran for president, but he didn't get the nomination of the Republican Party. And the result was that he ran on a third party ticket known as the Progressive Party or the Bull Moose Party. The biggest result of that was that the Republicans lost the election, and Woodrow Wilson ran as a progressive. So he was a Democrat, but the Democratic Party adopted the platform of the Progressive Party. And if you will, I think that you will remember that we talked about the shift in terms of which party was conservative and which party was liberal on social issues that happened in the election of 1912. So before 1912, the Liberal Party had been mostly the Republican Party, but after 1912, the Liberal Party becomes the Democratic Party. The thing about Woodrow Wilson was that Woodrow Wilson believed in American superiority. He was very much invested in what we think of as the idea of manifest destiny, that the American way was exactly the right way and that everybody else would eventually want to be just like us. And he promoted that in his foreign policy. So when we think about policy prior to Woodrow Wilson, we saw, as we mentioned last week, we saw the United States intervene in Latin American countries to support American imperial interests. But Woodrow Wilson did not think it was according to America's diplomatic or Americacy, really, to intervene in terms of supporting business. How he did think it was okay for the United States to intervene in support of democracy. And so we call Woodrow Wilson's diplomacy missionary diplomacy. The idea is the United States has a mission, and we've taught this before. It was one of the themes that we talked about, the American mission. Does anybody remember what the American mission is?
To spread democracy.
To spread liberty.
To spread liberty, exactly. Democracy is part of it. And that's one of the ways that we act. It's one of the shorthands that we use. But in reality, it's spreading that liberal ideology, which we summarize in the word liberty with an exclamation point. So that's democracy, secularism, capitalism. And Woodrow Wilson was a great believer that everybody should live like us. So now in 1910, we talked briefly about, earlier, we talked briefly about Mexico and how Mexico had become a kind of a stagnant state under the científicos. We talked about um, positivism. And by the time we get to 1910, Porfirio Diaz, who I don't have a picture of right here, Porfirio Diaz had been president for over 30 years, and his cabinet had not changed in over 30 years. And so there was a lot of criticism of that from foreign countries. And 1910 was the 100-year anniversary of what they consider to be Mexican independence. September 16th, 1810 was the day of El Grito. So when you guys are looking forward to Cinco de Mayo and you think that that's Mexican Independence Day, it's not. It's actually a national day of drinking in the United States. But maybe not this year, who knows? But at any rate, the 100-year anniversary, the centennial was coming up in 1910, and the president thought it would be they were opening up Mexico to the world. They were basically making a statement that they had modernized and that they were now part of one of the great countries of the world. And many people were invited to Mexico from all over the world to experience this anniversary. And in fact, they had actually rebuilt parts of Mexico City. So if you're familiar with Mexico City and you know the architecture of Avenida de la Revolucion with all the arcs and the arches, streets going off in like sunset patterns and things like that, that was all part of this centennial celebration. And one of the things that, as I mentioned, that people in the world were critical of was the fact that Mexico had not really moved toward democracy. And Porfirio Diaz had always said that as soon as Mexico modernized, then they would be ready for democracy and he would step aside. And he wanted to make a show of this during the 1910, or coming up on the 1910 centennial. And so he announced to the world that he was not going to run for president again. The result of that was that there was another man named Madero. I forgot his first name. It'll come to me. Anyway, Madero was a landowner from the north. He had been educated at the University of California in Berkeley, and he announced that he was going to run for president. And he was very popular because people in Mexico at this point were very excited about the idea that there was going to be real democracy. So what happened was that it became obvious that Madero was probably going to, if the vote was allowed to happen, Madero would be elected president. And this was a threat to Porfirio Diaz, who really had no intention of stepping aside. So he had Madero arrested. and the result of that was that Madero, he actually escaped from prison and went to Texas and announced what they call a pronunciamiento, or it's really kind of like a revolution. And this is the beginning of the Mexican Revolution. The Mexican Revolution will happen from 1910 until really sometime in the late 1920s. The military portion of it kind of ends in about 1920. But where it matters to us is that Madero actually was elected president during this revolution. And then there was a counter-revolution, which was led by this guy over here. his name is no, not Carranza. Huerta, Venustiano Huerta. No, it's not Venustiano. Anyway, the point here is it's Huerta, and Huerta was one of those people in history that not only looks evil but is evil, and he tries to turn back the clock to go back to the way it was under the Diaz presidency. Well, what was it like under the Diaz presidency? The answer was that the Diaz presidency was very supportive of foreign business in Mexico. So if you guys will recall the movie that we watched, Los Mineros, that the American Copper Company, owned by Colonel Green, actually owned part of Mexico. The Mexicans had actually sold land to foreigners, and it wasn't just Americans, it was French and British and Germans as well. And with all this foreign investment in Mexico, the problem, of course, with it is that all the wealth that was created by this investment went to the foreign countries. It went to America, Germany, England, and Mexico stayed poor. And at any rate, the point was that that these investors, the foreign investors, were very interested in maintaining order. So the foreigners actually assisted in this counter-revolution that was led by Huerta, and it included the American ambassador. So the result was that there was a battle in Mexico. It's called La Decena, which is the tragic days. And in the end, the president, Madero, was dead, and his vice president was dead, and Huerta had taken control with the help of foreign embassies, including the American ambassador. But this is something that President Wilson is going to be very much opposed to, because you will recall that President Wilson was very much in favor of extending American democracy, spreading American democracy, missionary diplomacy. And so what happens is that the American ambassador was recalled, and Wilson announced his opposition to Huerta's regime. So now there were actually two main leaders at this time in the revolution. And the two main leaders were, I should say, opposition leaders. The two main opposition leaders were this guy, Venustiano Carranza, and this guy, Pancho Villa. And the Venustiano Carranza was the leader of a party called the Constitucionalistas, or people who were in favor of the Constitution. So Wilson backed Carranza against Huerta. Now what happened was that the United States wanted to help the revolution in Mexico, and so they were looking for an opportunity to intervene. And they found the opportunity when there was an incident that happened in a little port on the Gulf Coast of Mexico called Tampico, where an American boat was actually captured by Mexican forces. They took the American crew off the boat, and that was seen by the United States as a violation of American sovereignty, because the little boat had an American flag on it. And so when Mexicans entered the boat, that was the same thing as invading the United States as far as Americans were concerned. So they demanded that the garrison, the Mexican garrison at Tampico, raise the American flag and fire a salute to it, which they obviously refused to do. And so the result was then that Wilson sent troops to occupy Veracruz. Now, why Veracruz? The answer is because that's where the customs house was. And that means that's where all the tariffs that were supporting the government were collected. And when they took Veracruz, that meant that the Huerta government couldn't get resupplies and it couldn't get money. And that led to the victory of Carranza. Carranza then becomes president. They hold a constitutional convention. The Constitution is rewritten. Then Mexico will again experience more disruption when Pancho Villa then rises up against Carranza. Okay, so Wilson is going to be in favor of Carranza because he's duly elected by a constitution, but the United States was also supporting Villa to a certain extent because Wilson really didn't like Carranza because of the fact that Carranza had essentially given the United States a one-fingered peace sign over Veracruz. He demanded that Americans leave Veracruz, and so the United States was hoping that somebody else would take over. What happens is that the United States eventually realizes that Carranza is going to win the war against Pancho Villa, and so they stop supporting Pancho Villa. And Pancho Villa will respond to that by crossing into the United States and invading a little town in New Mexico called Columbus, burns Columbus to the ground. And in response to that, then the United States will send troops to Mexico to try to find Pancho Villa so that he could be brought to trial. They never find him. And the United States almost goes to war with Mexico. There's actually a skirmish between the American army and the Mexican army, but Wilson backs off. And the reason why Wilson backs off is because he knows that there are big events happening now in Europe, and he believes that the United States will have to be involved in it. And he doesn't want to have the United States involved in a war on the American continent while there's a greater war going on in Europe. So he backs off. Okay, so any questions or comments about any of that? I can see your minds are wandering because you're wondering, why am I talking about all this? What has this got to do with World War I? The real reason why we want to worry about this is because it does show that there's a lot of tension between the United States and Mexico at the beginning of World War I, and it also shows us the kind of the attitude of the American president, which is that the American president is very much an idealist. He believes in using force, but he also believes that using the force must be for the idea of spreading democracy. Okay, so just keep that in mind as we go on then and we talk about what happens in Europe.